Good morning and welcome to another edition of Questions for Lawyers. I'm your host, Jeff Adelman, and today we are going to have a little bit of a different kind of show today because there is something going on that hasn't happened in 43 years. We have a race for the state attorney's office. Michael Satz is retiring, and there are 8 candidates running for the spot as Broward County State Attorney. So today it is my pleasure to welcome to Questions for Lawyers Joe Kimok from the Special Conflict Counsel, who is one of the candidates running for state attorney. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
If you could, can you please introduce yourself to the audience? Tell them a little bit about your background.
Sure. My name is Joe Kimok. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I'm the president of the local bar association, our local criminal defense bar association. And I'm running for state attorney because I believe it's time that we end mass incarceration. I think we can do that now. I'm the proud oldest son of a single mom. We were raised on food stamps, soup kitchens, a whole lot of love. Was lucky enough to be able to go to college and eventually law school. And right now, for the last several years, I have been a criminal defense lawyer with a state agency called Regional Conflict Counsel. We represent only indigent people. And I represent folks charged with everything from misdemeanors to homicide to folks facing the death penalty. And so I'm in these criminal courtrooms every single day. And I love my job. It's the best job I've ever had. And I think I'm pretty good at it. But I can't sit in these courtrooms anymore and watch this factory system of justice that we have. And so, the beginning of the year, a group of us got together and thought, what can we do to really make some systemic change? And electing a new prosecutor was top of the list. And so I threw my hat in, and here we are.
Well, again, it's a bold move, but you do have a lot of real life experience that you bring to the table that is unusual for somebody running for this position. Do you want to talk about some of the jobs you've had besides being a criminal defense attorney?
Sure. Well, growing up in poverty, I've been working since I was 14. I've been a dishwasher, a supermarket clerk. I was a commercial salmon fisherman for a summer in college, off the coast of Alaska, very dangerous catch style. And after I graduated from Florida State, I joined what's called Teach for America. They recruit highly talented kids to teach in inner cities. And I went and I taught at a low-income school in Houston, Texas. I taught high school English for 3 years. It was an amazing experience. My kids, many of them were undocumented immigrants. Many of them had very, very harrowing stories of how they came to this country. And it really just... I tell people I learned a lot more from them than they probably learned from me. But it was really an amazing experience. I then went to law school at Vanderbilt. When I graduated from Vanderbilt, I had a lot of options. I could have gone into civil. I had an offer at a big firm in Washington, D.C. But I believed in justice. I wanted to do something with my life that mattered. And I thought that the best way to do that was to join the prosecutor's office. And so I started as an assistant state attorney right here in Broward County, where I was for a little over 3 years, and learned in that process that being a prosecutor in an era of mass incarceration was not the type of justice that I was looking forward to fighting. Instead, what I was finding was that I was spending most of my time putting mostly Black and brown young men into prison for long periods of time for nonviolent offenses. And my discomfort grew and grew, and I'll never forget kind of the tipping point for me was I was in an airport in Atlanta, and I picked up a book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And she was able to articulate for me kind of everything that is wrong with the criminal justice system that I hadn't quite been able to articulate for myself. And 3 months later, I was gone. I'm now, like we said, a criminal defense lawyer solely for the indigent, and it's the best job I've ever had.
Well, in addition to your job as a teacher for indigent people, how did that experience shape you going into law school? Because most people, they go to college and they go to law school.
Mm-hmm.
You had a little gap in between, but that's what you were doing. How long were you teaching?
3 years.
Okay. How did that shape you?
Yeah. So teaching was the hardest job I've ever had. And any of your viewers or teachers, they'll probably relate. You meet so many amazing students. I mean, my students were inspiring to me, what they went through and what they were going through in order to create a better life for themselves. But living in a country, in a community that often didn't value them as individuals, right? And so these were folks that were dealing with not just often immigration issues, but folks dealing with extreme poverty, with gang violence, with malnutrition, with the normal everyday hormonal experience of being a 15-year-old. And yet they were showing up every morning to get a better life, to try to get a good education. And I've kept in touch with many of my students, and they are teachers now and community organizers and entrepreneurs who own their own companies. And so it's just been really inspiring for me that if these kids who experienced challenges that I could not have imagined growing up are able to succeed at a really, really high level, then it gives me inspiration that kind of we can achieve anything that we want if we really work hard enough for it.
Yeah, that's got to be very satisfying to keep in touch with those students and see that. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times about mass incarceration. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because we hear that in the current news cycle a lot. I don't think everybody knows what that means, though.
Sure. Mass incarceration is the state in which our country now exists, in which we have 2.3 million people currently behind bars in this country. That's more people than were slaves in 1850. In Florida, there are 96,000 of our neighbors in state prison, hundreds of thousands more in local jails or under some form of government control. The last estimate is that across the country, there are somewhere between 7 and 8 million people who are under some form of government control, probation, parole, house arrest. And when we have those huge numbers, the effect of that on a person's life, on a family's life, on a community's life is huge. And so what mass incarceration has become is essentially a way in which the government has oppressed people of color and poor people in a way that not just stays with them while they're going under the oppression, right? While they're in jail, while they're in prison, but for years and decades later. We know, for example, that the best way to reduce crime is to reduce poverty. Our system does the opposite. Our system makes it harder for folks to get a job. It puts fines on people over and over again. It suspends their driver's license so they can't go get a job. And so we don't have a criminal justice system anymore. We have a criminal legal system, and one in which that doesn't just have the effect of oppressing people, but is designed to do that. And so that's what we're here to try to dismantle.
And in what ways, if you were to be elected state attorney of Broward County, would you make changes to limit, to do something about mass incarceration?
Yeah. So there is no one silver bullet solution to that. It is a number of different points. So one easy thing we can do is to end cash bail. If you or I are arrested for a crime, they'll put a cash bond on us, and we can probably afford it and get out and fight our case from the outside. If we were indigent, if we were poor, we would sit in jail. And what that does is it creates two systems of justice, one for folks who can afford it to get out and one for folks who can't. And then those folks we know are more likely to plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit. They're more likely to get longer sentences than folks that are able to bond out. We can end the war on drugs. We can decriminalize drugs. We believe that addiction is better treated by experts in the community than by guards behind bars. And so when we take away an incentive of a police officer to arrest somebody, we decrease these negative interactions that folks are having with police, right? So if a police officer doesn't have an incentive to go and pat somebody down who's walking down the street in his own neighborhood looking for drugs because we're not going to charge the drugs, then that officer is more likely to go up and have a conversation with the person as opposed to making this a confrontation. We believe that we need to end the school to prison pipeline. We know that the moment that we put a child into handcuffs, that child is more likely to recidivate and become a hardened criminal down the road. If they spend one night in a detention center, if they miss 1 day of school in order to go to court, that those numbers get even higher and higher as the kids that then are less likely to graduate high school and more likely to become criminals down the road. We believe that for kids, and back up 1 point, Florida leads the country in charging kids as adults. And the next state, Oregon, isn't even close. We are far and away a leader in charging kids as adults. We don't believe that kids should ever be in adult jail. We don't believe that kids should ever be in solitary confinement, which is where they often end up when they are sent to an adult jail. And so what we have said is that we will eliminate what's called direct file, which is the process by which the prosecutor unilaterally decides which kids get charged as adults. And then what we've said is that for kids, the default should be diversion and rehabilitation, not incarceration. Incarceration of anyone is an act of violence. We know that. We know that when we put anyone behind bars, we are doing an act of violence upon them. It is even more so when it's a kid. And what we have said is that can only be done in the most extreme of circumstances. Instead, under mass incarceration, what we have had for decades now is a lock them up first, figure it out later philosophy. Let's lock them up, get them arrested, get them in the system, and then try and use the system as best we can to help them. And it hasn't worked. And we've been doing the same thing over and over again. And juvenile crime is still very high. And what we say is, look, we need to use our resources on the front end, treat kids like kids, and that will make all of us safer. We also think to dismantle mass incarceration, there are a whole lot of crimes that we shouldn't be charging, right? So we have said we will not charge any possession of marijuana offenses in any amount. Quality of life crimes. We don't think that sex work should be criminalized. Arresting homeless people for trespass or for loitering. We think there are much better uses of our resources than throwing these folks in jail. And so those are obviously a smattering of ways in which we can reduce both the overall number of people that are arrested, but then also charged. And then there's the good side of that, right? When we start reducing the resources that we're spending on nonviolent folks, we can hire more homicide detectives. We can hire more sexual assault prosecutors, folks that can focus on preventing violent crime. And so this isn't this isn't a situation where if we stop arresting folks, if we stop charging folks, isn't that going to make us less safe? No, we actually think that it will make us safer, and we're seeing that in some of the other communities in which a progressive prosecutor has been elected.
Now, you mentioned about not prosecuting marijuana crimes. I know recently there was an announcement, I believe, from the Broward County State Attorney's Office. They're not going to prosecute with 3 ounces or less. Is that what it was?
For misdemeanors, it must be at least 3 ounces. For felonies, it must be at least 25 ounces.
And by just looking at that, I think what you're saying is, if there's not a reason to have the confrontation with the person, it doesn't lead to other incidents that are far worse, because there's already an apprehension if, say, a law enforcement officer is approaching somebody for something that's a nonviolent crime, and sometimes that can lead to something more.
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, there are communities here in Broward County who are more afraid of police officers than they are of violent criminals. And we need to recognize that, right? We need to look at the reasons for that. And the reasons for that is they get pulled over driving in their own neighborhood. They get stopped riding a bike on the street. I represented a man once who was literally pulled over for biking on the wrong side of the street in his own neighborhood. I represented a guy once who was walking in his own neighborhood and was pulled over or was stopped for not walking on the sidewalk, right? And so these things don't happen in all neighborhoods. They happen in low-income neighborhoods, and they happen in Black and brown neighborhoods. We think that if we can eliminate the incentive for police officers to do that, to stop folks looking for drugs, then we change the dynamic. We change that relationship from one of distrust to one of trust. And so that's obviously one of the many benefits of decriminalizing drugs. We also know it works as far as addiction is concerned. We look to other countries like Portugal, who has had amazing experiences with decriminalizing drugs, and it has significantly reduced their addiction rates. Seattle, Washington, is also led by a progressive prosecutor, has also had some really good results in decreasing their addiction rates by, instead of arresting folks who have drugs on them, getting them the help that they need on the front end. And so, it's just a win-win. The war on drugs has been the worst mistake in our nation's history over the last 30 years as it pertains to what we're doing to our own citizens. The number of lives that we've ruined, the number of families that we've ruined, the number of communities that we have kept oppressed, all in the name of the war on drugs, is something that I know that we're going to look back as a dark stain on our history one day.
Often the term mental health gets thrown out there, and this issue and so many other issues get thrown that are really mental health type of issues, and the resources are not made available to these people. And the point is, we're better off having whole people, or people that can be pieced back together, than broken people who are released and go right back into the system.
Yeah. The number one mental health provider in Broward County is the Broward County Jail. We have essentially shut down most of our state-run, government-run mental health facilities. And so then for folks who don't have insurance, who need help, there's nowhere for them to go. And what ends up happening is they go out on the street, or they act out, or find themselves in the criminal justice system. And I can tell you, as someone who has spent a significant amount of time in the mental health jail, it's called the North Broward Jail here in Broward County, that it trying to help someone's mental health while at the same time keeping them in shackles and often alone in a room is very counterproductive. And so you're right. So they'll go through the process. Eventually they'll get out, and we haven't addressed the root cause of what's wrong there, of the crime itself. And so it's only a matter of time that we see folks like this recidivate. We need a massive investment in mental health in our community and in communities across the country. What I have said as state attorney is we need to do a much better job on the front end of diverting these folks to mental health facilities. Let's not suck them into the system where the system itself usually does more harm than good. Let's get them the help that they need in the community, so that both we can help the individual, but then we can also, prevent future crime.
Now, obviously, there's going to be people out there watching that are either law enforcement or always on the side of law enforcement. And like everything else in life, there's one way, the other way, and then in the middle is really the truth. What would you say to those people who think that, because of your positions and all that, that means that somehow you wouldn't be tough on crime, on violent offenders?
Yeah. The good cops, first of all, don't like bad cops. It gives them a bad name, right? It makes their life much more difficult. And good cops don't want to be messing around with these low-level drug offenses, with nonviolent offenders. That's not why they signed up to risk their lives, right? They signed up to risk their lives to protect people, to make our community safer. And that's what our whole campaign is about, is that we are very much safer when we are freer, when we don't have the government's foot on our neck with our fines and fees, with walking down the street. And so by decreasing, like we said earlier, by decreasing the amount of resources that we spend on these nonviolent offenses, on folks that don't pose any threat to us, we can then use those resources in better ways, like finding the root causes to crime, like investigating homicides, investigating sexual assaults. And so what I say to those folks is, this is not an anti-police campaign by any stretch of the imagination. There is a much better way to keep us safe. Having said that, look, there's going to be growing pains, and we understand that. The mass incarceration, and we've had the same state attorney for 44 years. We've been doing it very much the same way for 40 years. And so it will be a challenge for us when we become state attorney to sell this vision, right? To continue to have these conversations with police chiefs, with officers working a beat, that there is a different vision, and that this vision keeps us significantly safer than what we've been doing. And so we're going to have a lot of work to do to kind of build those bridges, to create this new generation.
This is, again, I think that people focus on presidential elections, senator elections, governor elections, but this is something that really does affect everyday people's lives, the state attorney in the county that they live. One of the issues that's always a hot button issue. I mean, the Orange County prosecutor, I think, got some static a few years ago. She said she will not be asking for the death penalty in Orange County, in Orlando. I believe I'm right about that. What is your position with regards to the death penalty?
I am very much opposed to the death penalty.
Why is that?
The death penalty is an immoral. It is unethical. I don't believe the government has the right to take a life. So for me, the question is not whether somebody deserves to die. The question for me is whether we have a right to kill. I am an imperfect person. I know that I'm imperfect. And as state attorney, I will be imperfect. And that scares me, right? That scares me in the sense that I could make a mistake. We know in the state of Florida that state of Florida leads the country in exonerations from death row. There are 27 people who were on death row who are now who were exonerated, found to be legally innocent. We also know that the death penalty isn't about the worst of the worst. Our experience with the death penalty tells us that. Instead, the death penalty is about race, and it's about poverty, and it's about mental illness. Those are the three common factors in the vast majority of folks that end up being sentenced to the death penalty. The death penalty is also dying. It's dying across the country. Across the world. We're on a very short list, and the list of the other countries that are still using it it's not a list you necessarily want to be on.
Right.
And it's dying across the country. There are only 3% of counties in the United States still regularly impose the death penalty.
3%.
3% of counties regularly impose the death penalty. There are about half the states still have it on their books, but they're not actually issuing any death sentences. And then even in states like Texas, Florida, Georgia, and California, where we're seeing lots of death sentences, it's relegated to a small number of counties. Broward County is one of those counties. We are still very much regularly imposing the death penalty. The governor of California just a few months ago announced that he would not be executing anybody that was on death row. And California has the largest number of folks that are currently on death row. And so, we also know that it's a money issue, that the death penalty costs us, by some estimates, 20 times the amount that a life in prison sentence would cost us.
A lot of people don't realize that.
Right. They think it's the opposite. They think, well, why am I going to use my tax dollars to lock somebody up for the rest of their lives? I get that. From a purely economic standpoint, it actually costs considerably more to kill somebody than it does to lock them up forever. And for me, the policy parts of it are important. The money part is important. The fairness part is important. But for me, it is very much, like I said, a moral issue. I've represented somebody earlier this year. I went to trial on a death penalty case on a man that I believed was innocent. Now, after 7 weeks, we ended in a hung jury and on what's called guilt phase on whether or not he actually committed the crime. But the experience of sitting there for 7 weeks next to a man that I cared for, while two very smart prosecutors did everything to kill him, everything that they could to kill him, was a very enlightening experience for me. And I was opposed to the death penalty long before that. But to sit in a room while two individuals that you ordinarily respect spend hours upon hours plotting to kill somebody, to me, that's just not who we are. That's not who we are as a community. It's not who we should be as a country. And so I am opposed to the death penalty. Now, with the Ayala issue presents an interesting challenge, right? And so Miss Ayala was very courageous shortly after she was elected, and she said that she would not seek the death penalty, as have numerous prosecutors across the country. The Florida Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional, that a state attorney must consider the death penalty in an appropriate circumstance. And so as state attorney, I will consider it. I don't know that I'll ever seek it. We will have a very transparent process in which the community will know why or why not we're seeking the death penalty, which we don't have right now, by the way. I mean, I'm in the system and I don't know how they make the decisions that they make over there to seek the death penalty or not. And so, but like I said, there have been, there will be the opportunity. Folks there's going to be first degree murders during the camp during my term.
In our community, I mean, we have to at least mention the Douglas shooting. The killer, his trial is going to be coming up, and it could be coming up
next year.
Yeah, next year. After if you are elected as state attorney, it could be your decision with that. So that brings in a lot of different issues as well as to whether or not he'll even get it.
Yeah. So
because I think that what gets lost in all this is, I live in Coral Springs. I couldn't be angrier about everything that happened. I also have read about his history and everything else, and I'm concerned about going through a trial and having him convicted and not getting the death penalty, and a lot of people being really upset. I don't think they understand how it works.
Yeah, I mean, now in order to get the death penalty, it's very, very difficult, which is good. That's a good thing. Up until really 3 years ago in the state of Florida, you could get the death penalty with a non-unanimous jury. So 12 people, they could not agree. They could not agree on whether the person could get the death penalty, and as long as it was a majority who believed that the person should get the death penalty, then the death penalty was an option. The judge could give it. Now you have to have all 12, and to find 12 people who agree that the person should be executed makes it much more difficult, which is a good thing. But it also means that you're right, especially in the Cruz situation, he has real mitigation. I mean, he has real mental health problems, and there's no telling what that will do. But let's think about, I'm going to take it a step further. Let's think about what that trial is going to do for what has already done and will do for our community. The building where the shooting happened is still standing, despite the Stoneman Douglas community wanting it torn down. Kids and teachers have to walk by that building every single day because the state attorney has ordered that it stay up so that he can parade jurors through there and essentially traumatize them into trying to get a death penalty. That's an extraordinary cost. And is it worth it?
Several $1 million a year just to maintain
the building. Mm-hmm. Then you think about the cost of the trial. There's an economic cost. The estimate is about $7 million that it's going to cost just for the trial that we are going to pay for. But more importantly is the cost, the emotional cost that the trial is going to have on our community. We are going to be forced to live through the worst collective day of our lives over and over and over again for this trial. And it doesn't have to be, right? And it's only worse for the folks that were actually impacted, that had loved ones there. The alternative, his lawyers have said that he'll plead guilty to life and 34 counts of consecutive life in prison tomorrow. And if he were to do that, he'd go off to prison, he'd sit in a box for the rest of his life, and we would never hear from him again. We'd never see him again. By going forward with the death penalty, we are giving him the very attention that he sought from the beginning. He'll be on the news every night during the trial. If he's given the death penalty, then he'll be on the news throughout the course of his appeals. And eventually, 20 years from now, there will be news cameras and protesters and folks outside the prison when he's put to death. If we were to accept the life without parole sentence now, he would never get out. And let's be very, very clear about that. He would never, ever, ever get out. And he would look at four walls for the rest of his life and at some point die with a whimper. And we might hear about it, we might not. To me, that's preferable. And so, you know, my heart goes out next year when we expect the trial to go forward, specifically to members of the Stoneman Douglas community, because it's going to be extraordinarily difficult as we are kind of dragged through this trial.
Yeah, well, again, I think that's a major issue. And being part of the Coral Springs community and living less than a mile from Douglas, I drive by that building probably every other day. And I just keep thinking, what, it's up there because of that. And I'm just concerned over the fact that there's no question that he's going to be found guilty,
Right.
But are people going to get the result? And even if they get it, is it really going to, it's not going to heal.
Right.
And that's the concern for me. Well, Joe, I can't thank you enough for coming on with me and speaking to everybody about why you're running for state attorney. I want to just give you an opportunity to just give a closing argument or whatever you'd like to say to what differentiates you from the other 8 people that are running and why people should vote for you on August 18th, 2020.
Sure. You alluded to it earlier. This really is the most important election that Broward County residents will vote for in 2020. The role of the state attorney has more impact on your lives than the president does, than your county commissioner does, than your mayor does. He or she is going to decide whether you or your loved one or somebody you care about is charged with a crime at some point. We know that. Everybody knows somebody who's been caught up in the system somehow. I am the only candidate who has come forward with a comprehensive policy issues-based platform. And that's what differentiates us. In this race, you've got some career prosecutors, you've got some politicians. I'm the only one who's in the trenches, on the ground, representing indigent folks every single day. And we are the only ones who, because of that experience, have been able to articulate a real platform for dismantling mass incarceration. It includes ending all cash bail, not just some of it. It includes ending the war on drugs. It includes dismantling the school to prison pipeline. And one thing we didn't talk about, it includes creating and fully funding a conviction integrity unit so that folks that are in prison who were wrongfully convicted can be let out. And it includes getting some sentencing justice. Even for folks that are convicted of property crimes, burglary, robbery, are receiving astronomically long sentences. And so we have come out with a platform both to reduce those sentences on the front end, but then also to look at some of these longer sentences of folks that are in prison who received long mandatory minimums over the last couple decades, and look at those sentences and see how we can get them out early, how we can bring some sort of sentencing justice to them. I have a website, www.joekimok.com. It's on the screen. And there, I think if you look at my website and you compare it to any of the other candidates, you'll see we have the most comprehensive platform that creates a real vision for dismantling mass incarceration. And so I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate you having me.
It was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation, and just so many interesting topics when you're talking about law enforcement and prosecutions and things that really do affect so many people and their families.
Absolutely. I'll just close. We have lived under mass incarceration about 40 years. And so for most of us that have been born within that time, it's the only system we've ever known. But it hasn't been the system in the over the course of our history, of our nation's history. We were founded on the very idea of freedom. And for a country that was founded on freedom, we are the most unfree nation on earth. And it doesn't have to be that way. But the best way to change that is to elect a progressive prosecutor. I hope I can earn everybody's vote.
Well, again, I really appreciate you coming on. I wish you good luck on August 18th, 2020. Joe Kimok, Broward County State Attorney candidate. Next week, we will be having another Joe Bellotta, who's a Social Security disability attorney on questions for lawyers. Again, we try to get different people on the air to ask different questions. And this was a special program because we have a political race going on, and I love talking about those things too. And so again, I really appreciate you coming on. Wish you good luck. And if anybody again wants to contact Joe, joekimok.com, you can see it up on the screen. He's happy to answer any further questions you have. Next week, September 27th, we'll have Joe Bellotta, Social Security disability attorney. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching, listening. I'm attorney Jeff Adelman. Be well.